The wheat field stretched endlessly under the Nebraska sky, golden waves dancing in the summer breeze. Most people saw nothing but farmland, but Maria saw something different when she looked up. Every few hours, a tiny silver dot would cross, the blue canvas above leaving a thin white trail behind it. While other kids her age were playing with dolls or learning to bake, Maria was lying on her back in those fields, watching planes disappear into the distance. Her father thought it was just a phase. Her mother worried it wasn't normal for a girl to be so obsessed with flying machines. But Maria knew better. Something deep inside her chest would flutter every time she heard that distant rumble of jet engines. It was like her heart was trying to tell her something important. Growing up in a town of barely 3,000 people, dreams of flying seemed impossible. The closest airport was 30 miles away, and it was just a small strip where crop dusters landed to refuel. But when Maria turned 16, she convinced her parents to let her work there after school. She told them she wanted to earn money for college, but really, she just wanted to be near the planes. Old Pete, who ran the airport, was surprised when this skinny teenager showed up asking for work. Most kids her age were more interested in their phones than getting their hands dirty with engine grease. But Maria was different. She would arrive early and stay late, asking endless questions about how everything worked. Pete started teaching her about engines, fuel systems, and all the mechanical parts that kept planes in the air. Years passed and Maria became the best mechanic Pete had ever trained. She could diagnose engine problems just by listening to the sound they made. Her hand seemed to know exactly which tool to reach for before her brain even processed the problem. The local pilots started requesting her specifically when their planes needed work. They trusted her completely, which was rare for someone so young in such a technical field. But fixing planes wasn't enough anymore. Every time Maria watched one take off, that same feeling would stir in her chest. She wanted to be up there, controlling those powerful machines, dancing with the clouds. She started spending her evenings at the local library, reading everything she could find about aviation. She learned about aerodynamics, weather patterns, navigation systems, and flight theory. The librarian had to order special books just to keep up with her appetite for knowledge. When Maria turned 28, she made a decision that shocked everyone in town. She announced she was applying to the Thunderbird Advanced Pilot Training Camp, one of the most elite aviation programs in the country. The program was legendary for producing the best military pilots, and getting accepted was harder than getting into medical school. Her parents thought she had lost her mind. Her friends couldn't understand why she would leave a steady job for such an impossible dream. Even Pete, who had watched her grow into an amazing mechanic, tried to talk her out of it. The program was designed for young military academy graduates with perfect records and family connections. Maria was just a small-town mechanic with no formal aviation education and no military background. But Maria had something they didn't expect. She had spent 12 years learning every detail about how planes worked. She understood aircraft systems better than most flight instructors. Her application essay was filled with technical knowledge that impressed even the toughest reviewers. When they called her for an interview, she answered every question with the confidence of someone who had lived and breathed aviation for over a decade. The acceptance letter arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in February. Maria's hands shook as she opened the envelope, afraid to hope. When she saw the word "Congratulations," she actually screamed loud enough that her neighbor came running over to check if she was okay. For the first time in her life, the impossible seemed possible. The training camp was located at a massive airbase in Colorado, surrounded by mountains that touched the clouds. When Maria arrived, she felt like she was entering a different world. Everything was bigger, faster, and more intense than anything she had ever experienced. The other candidates looked like they had stepped out of a military recruitment poster. They were young, confident, and had the kind of polish that came from expensive educations and family traditions of service. Maria felt out of place from the moment she walked into the orientation room. The other candidates talked about their experiences at military academies, their fathers who were generals, and their summers spent at exclusive flight camps. When they asked her about her background, she simply said she was a mechanic from Nebraska. The conversation would usually die there, followed by polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. During the first week of training, the differences became even more obvious. While Maria struggled with the military protocols and formal procedures, she excelled at anything technical. When they studied aircraft systems, she could answer questions that stumped students who had spent 4 years at aviation colleges. When they practiced emergency procedures, her mechanical knowledge helped her solve problems that others couldn't even identify. The instructors noticed her unusual combination of strengths and weaknesses. Colonel Peterson, the head of the program, watched her carefully during practical exercises. He had never seen someone with such intuitive understanding of aircraft mechanics who was also struggling with basic military bearing. It was like watching a master craftsman trying to learn ballet, but the social challenges were the hardest part. The other candidates formed tight groups based on their shared backgrounds and experiences. They would study together, eat together, and support each other through the difficult training. Maria found herself eating alone most nights, reviewing her notes while listening to the laughter from nearby tables where her classmates shared stories she couldn't relate to. Some of the candidates weren't just indifferent to her presence, they were actively hostile. They whispered that she didn't belong there, that she was taking a spot from someone more deserving. A few made jokes about the grease monkey from nowhere, just loud enough for her to hear. Maria tried to ignore them and focus on her training, but the constant isolation was wearing her down. Despite everything, Maria's performance in the cockpit was remarkable. When she finally got her hands on the controls of a training aircraft, something magical happened. All the years of dreaming, studying, and imagining came together in perfect harmony. She flew like she had been born to it, with a natural grace that couldn't be taught. Her landings were smooth, her navigation was precise, and her emergency responses were lightning fast. The flight instructors were amazed. Captain Rodriguez, who had been flying for 20 years, told his colleagues that Maria had the best natural instincts he had ever seen in a new pilot. She seemed to understand what the aircraft needed before the instruments even registered a problem. It was the kind of intuitive connection that separated good pilots from great ones. But even her exceptional flying skills couldn't overcome the growing tension in the program. The social dynamics were becoming more difficult each day, and Maria could feel the weight of everyone's doubts pressing down on her. She was fighting not just to learn how to fly military aircraft, but to prove that someone like her deserved to be there at all. Every night, Maria would call her parents from the payphone outside her dormitory. Her mother would ask if she was happy, and Maria would always say yes, even when tears were streaming down her face. She had worked too hard and come too far to admit that the dream was turning into a nightmare. But deep down, she wondered if everyone else was right, if she really didn't belong in this world of elite pilots and military precision. The truth was, Maria belonged in the sky more than anyone else in that program. She just didn't know it yet. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 every morning, but Maria was already awake. She had been staring at the ceiling for hours, her mind racing through flight procedures and emergency protocols. Sleep had become a luxury she couldn't afford, not when every day felt like a test she might fail. Week 3 brought advanced navigation training, and Maria threw herself into the coursework with desperate determination. While her classmates complained about the complexity of the material, she found herself genuinely fascinated by the intricate dance of coordinates, weather patterns, and flight paths. Her notebook filled with detailed diagrams and calculations that went far beyond what was required, but her enthusiasm only seemed to make things worse with her fellow trainees. During a break between classes, she overheard 2 of them talking near the vending machines. "She's trying too hard," one of them said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Acting like she knows more than everyone else. My dad always said mechanics think they understand flying just because they can fix engines," the other replied with a laugh. "But there's a difference between turning wrenches and actually being a pilot." Maria pretended not to hear, but their words cut deep. She wasn't trying to show off. She was just genuinely interested in learning everything she could. Back home, her curiosity had been seen as an asset. Here, it seemed to mark her as an outsider even more clearly. The physical training was brutal, but Maria had been working with her hands her entire life. While some of her classmates struggled with the demanding exercise routines, she kept pace without much difficulty. Her years of lifting heavy aircraft parts and crawling into tight engine compartments had given her a practical strength that served her well. It was during combat simulation training that things really started to fall apart. The exercise required teams of 4, and Maria consistently found herself as the last person picked. When teams were finally formed, her teammates would barely communicate with her, sharing information among themselves while leaving her to figure things out on her own. Captain Wilson, one of the instructors, noticed the dynamic during a particularly challenging scenario. Maria's team was supposed to coordinate a complex rescue mission, but her teammates kept excluding her from planning discussions. When the simulation failed, they were quick to blame her for not following protocols she had never been told about. "This isn't working," Captain Wilson told Colonel Peterson after class. "The social dynamics are affecting performance. That young woman has some of the best technical skills I've seen, but she's being frozen out." Colonel Peterson nodded grimly. He had been watching the situation develop for weeks. Military training required teamwork and trust, but Maria seemed unable to build those crucial relationships with her peers. It wasn't entirely her fault, but the reality was that pilots needed to work together seamlessly, especially in combat situations. The breaking point came during week 6, in the most unexpected way possible. Maria had been preparing for the advanced navigation exam for days, studying route planning and emergency procedures until her eyes burned from staring at charts and manuals. She felt confident about the material and arrived at the testing room early, as always. The exam was comprehensive, covering everything from basic compass navigation to complex GPS systems and backup procedures. Maria worked through each question methodically, double-checking her calculations and referring to the formulas she had memorized. When she finished, she felt good about her performance for the first time in weeks. 2 days later, Captain Rodriguez called her into his office. His expression was serious and Maria felt her stomach drop before he even spoke. "We need to discuss your navigation exam," he said, sliding a copy of her test across the desk. "These answers are remarkably similar to the answer key." Maria stared at the paper in confusion. "I don't understand. What do you mean?" "I mean that several of your responses match the instructor's guide word for word, including a specific calculation method that wasn't covered in class materials." The accusation hit her like a physical blow. "Sir, I would never cheat. I studied for hours every night. I can show you my notes, my practice problems." Captain Rodriguez held up his hand. "The evidence suggests otherwise. This particular calculation method appears in an instructor's manual that students aren't supposed to have access to." Maria's mind raced. She had used a shortcut method for one of the navigation problems, something she had learned years ago from an old pilot who used to bring his plane to Pete's airport. The man had taught her several techniques that weren't in standard textbooks, calling them old-school tricks that experienced pilots used to save time. "I learned that method from a pilot back home," she explained desperately. "He showed me several shortcuts that experienced aviators use. I've been using those techniques for years." But her explanation sounded weak even to her own ears. How could she prove that an old crop duster pilot had taught her something years ago? She had no documentation, no witnesses except Pete, who was 1,000 miles away. The investigation that followed was thorough and humiliating. Maria's study materials were examined, her background was questioned, and several of her classmates were interviewed about her behavior. The process took 3 days, during which she was suspended from all training activities and confined to her dormitory room. The isolation was devastating. Maria sat alone in her small room, listening to her classmates going about their normal routines in the hallway outside. She could hear their conversations, their laughter, their complaints about difficult instructors and challenging exercises. The sounds of the life she was being cut off from. On the 3rd day, Colonel Peterson summoned her to his office. The walk across the base felt like a death march. Other personnel stopped their conversations to watch her pass, and Maria realized that word of the cheating accusation had spread throughout the facility. Colonel Peterson's office was filled with commendations, photographs of aircraft, and models of various military planes. Under different circumstances, Maria would have been fascinated by the display. Now she could barely focus on anything except the man behind the desk who held her future in his hands. "Miss Rodriguez," he began, using her last name with the formal distance that military protocols required. "After careful consideration of all the evidence, we've made our decision regarding your status in this program." Maria held her breath, even though she already knew what was coming. "While we cannot definitively prove that academic dishonesty occurred, the circumstances raise serious questions about the integrity of your performance. More importantly, your inability to integrate effectively with your fellow trainees has become a significant concern." The words felt rehearsed, like he had practiced this speech before delivering it. Maria wanted to interrupt, to defend herself, to explain that the social problems weren't entirely her fault. But she knew it wouldn't matter. "Military aviation requires absolute trust between team members," Colonel Peterson continued. "Pilots must be able to rely on each other completely without question or hesitation. The dynamics we've observed suggest that this level of trust and integration may not be achievable in your case." He paused, and Maria could hear her own heartbeat in the silence. "Therefore, we've decided to terminate your participation in the Thunderbird Advanced Pilot Training Program, effective immediately." The room seemed to spin around her. All those years of dreaming, studying, and working toward this moment. And it was over in a single sentence. Maria tried to speak, but no words came out. Her throat felt like it was closing up. "You have until tomorrow morning to collect your belongings and arrange transportation home," Colonel Peterson added, his voice not unkind but utterly final. "I want you to know that this decision wasn't made lightly. You have demonstrated exceptional technical knowledge and natural flying ability, under different circumstances." He didn't finish the sentence, but Maria understood. Under different circumstances, she might have belonged there. But these weren't different circumstances, and she didn't belong anywhere except back home in Nebraska, fixing crop dusters and watching other people's dreams disappear into the sky. That night, Maria packed her few belongings in silence while her former classmates whispered in the hallway outside her room. Tomorrow she would begin the long journey back to a life that suddenly felt impossibly small. 6 months had passed since Maria returned to Nebraska with her tail between her legs. The small airport felt even smaller now, like a cage that had shrunk around her dreams. Every morning she would arrive at Pete's hangar before sunrise, hoping that staying busy would keep the disappointment from eating her alive. Pete had welcomed her back without asking too many questions. He could see the pain in her eyes and knew better than to poke at fresh wounds. But he also noticed that something had changed in her. The girl who used to hum while working on engines now moved through her tasks in silence. Her technical skills had somehow gotten even better during her time away, but the joy seemed to have been drained out of her. "You're different," Pete finally said one afternoon as they worked on an old Cessna together. "That fancy school taught you some new tricks, but it took something away too." Maria didn't look up from the engine she was rebuilding. Some lessons are more expensive than others. The local pilots had welcomed her back warmly. They didn't care about her failure at the training camp. They just knew she was the best mechanic within 100 miles. Word had spread about her expanded. Knowledge and planes started arriving from farther away, their owners specifically requesting her expertise. But success felt hollow now. Every time Maria heard a jet engine overhead, she would stop whatever she was doing and look up. The sound still stirred something deep in her chest, but now it was mixed with a bitter taste of what might have been. She had touched her dream and watched it slip through her fingers. The weather that October had been unusually calm, the kind of peaceful autumn that Nebraska farmers loved. Clear skies stretched endlessly in every direction. Perfect flying conditions that made Maria's heart ache with longing. She spent her evenings reading aviation magazines and watching flight videos online, torturing herself with reminders of the world she had been expelled from. Then, on a Tuesday that started like any other, everything changed. Maria was alone in the hangar, working late on a stubborn fuel pump, when she heard thunder in the distance. She looked outside and saw storm, clouds building on the horizon, moving fast across the plains. Within an hour, the peaceful evening had transformed into a violent tempest with winds that bent trees almost to the ground. The storm system was massive, one of those late-season monsters that meteorologists track nervously on their radar screens. Maria secured everything she could and settled in to wait it out, listening to the wind howl around the small building like an angry beast. Around midnight, she heard something that didn't belong to the storm. Through the thunder and rain there was another sound, mechanical and desperate. A jet engine, but not the steady rumble of a plane passing overhead. This was erratic, stressed, the sound of an aircraft in serious trouble. Maria ran outside into the driving rain, squinting up at the dark sky. Lightning illuminated the clouds for brief moments, and during one of those flashes she saw it. A military jet, flying much too low and clearly struggling to maintain control. As she watched, it banked sharply toward the airport, its landing, lights cutting through the storm like desperate signals for help. The plane came in fast and rough, hitting the small runway with a jarring impact that sent sparks flying from its landing gear. It skidded sideways before finally coming to rest near the far end of the strip, steam rising from its hot engines as the cold rain hit them. Maria grabbed her emergency kit and ran toward the aircraft, her heart pounding with adrenaline and professional concern. As she got closer, she realized what she was looking at and nearly stopped in her tracks. It was an F-22 Raptor, one of the most advanced fighter jets in the world. She had only seen them in photographs and videos, but there was no mistaking that distinctive angular shape. The cockpit was already opening as she approached, and a figure in a flight suit climbed out awkwardly. The pilot was clearly hurt, favoring his left leg and moving with the careful precision of someone fighting pain and disorientation. "Are you okay?" Maria called out, having to shout over the wind. The pilot looked up, surprise evident, even through his helmet visor. "What are you doing out here? This is a restricted aircraft emergency." "I work here," Maria replied, getting close enough to support his weight as he climbed down. "Let me help you. There's shelter in the hangar." Lieutenant Commander Jackson had been flying for 12 years, but he had never experienced weather like this. The storm had appeared out of nowhere, creating conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. When his aircraft's flight control system started malfunctioning, he had been forced to make an emergency landing at the first available strip. Now, sitting in the warmth of Pete's small office while Maria examined his injured ankle, he was trying to process the situation. He was stranded at a tiny civilian airport with a damaged $50 million aircraft in the middle of a storm that showed no signs of letting up. "The ankle's not broken," Maria announced after a careful examination, "but it's badly sprained. You need to stay off it for at least a few days." Jackson nodded grimly. "I need to contact my base, let them know what happened, but first I need to assess the damage to my aircraft." "In this weather?" Maria looked out at the storm, which seemed to be getting worse rather than better. "You can barely stand, and visibility is 0 out there. It can wait until morning." But Jackson was already reaching for his radio, trying to establish contact with his home base. The storm was interfering with communications, creating static and dead zones that made clear transmission impossible. After 20 minutes of frustrated attempts, he finally gave up. "This is a nightmare," he muttered. "That aircraft contains some of the most classified technology in the military. It can't just sit out there unguarded." Maria poured him another cup of coffee, thinking carefully about what she was going to say next. "I've been around aircraft my entire life. If you want, I could take a look at the damage once the storm passes. Maybe I can help figure out what needs to be fixed." Jackson looked at her skeptically. "No offense, but this isn't exactly a crop duster. The F-22 systems are incredibly complex. It takes years of specialized training just to understand the basics." "I know," Maria said quietly, "but I might know more than you think." When morning finally came, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and strangely quiet. Maria and Lieutenant Commander Jackson made their way out to the F-22, which looked even more impressive in daylight. Despite its rough landing, the aircraft was beautiful, all angles and curves designed for speed and stealth. Jackson limped around the plane, examining the exterior damage while Maria followed at a respectful distance. There were scrapes and dents from the hard landing, but nothing that looked catastrophic from the outside. "The real problems are probably internal," Jackson explained. The flight control system was giving me error messages throughout the approach. Could be anything from sensor failures to hydraulic problems. He opened several access panels, revealing a maze of wires, circuits, and mechanical components that would have intimidated most people. But as Maria looked at the sophisticated systems, something amazing happened. Despite the advanced technology and military specifications, she began to recognize patterns and principles that weren't so different from civilian aircraft. "The hydraulic lines run along here," she said, pointing to a series of tubes near the landing gear. "And these look like backup sensors for the flight control system." Jackson stared at her in surprise. "How did you know that?" Maria felt a familiar flutter of excitement, the same feeling she used to get when solving complex mechanical problems. Aircraft systems follow certain basic principles, even in advanced fighters. The technology might be more sophisticated, but the fundamentals are still the same. For the first time in months, Maria felt like herself again. Standing next to this incredible machine, her mind was racing with possibilities and solutions. She had been cast out of the world of elite aviation, but somehow that world had come to her. The sun climbed higher as Maria and Lieutenant Commander Jackson worked together to diagnose the F-22's problems. What started as a skeptical partnership had quickly evolved into something resembling mutual respect. Jackson watched in amazement as Maria identified systems and components that should have been completely foreign to a civilian mechanic. "The primary flight computer is throwing error codes," Jackson explained, showing her the diagnostic display. "But I can't tell if it's a hardware failure or a software glitch. Without the proper testing equipment, we're basically flying blind." Maria studied the readout carefully, her mind working through the possibilities. "Can you show me the error sequence exactly as it happened during your approach?" Jackson pulled up the flight data on his portable tablet, and Maria watched the cascade of warnings that had nearly brought down the aircraft. Her eyes moved quickly across the screen, looking for patterns that others might miss. "There," she said, pointing to a specific timestamp. "The errors started after you hit that rough air pocket about 10 minutes before landing. Look at the sequence. Hydraulic pressure dropped first, then the flight control system started compensating, but the compensation created stress on the backup sensors." Jackson stared at the data, then at Maria. "That's exactly what happened. But how did you—" "It's like a puzzle," Maria explained, her excitement growing. "Every system in an aircraft talks to every other system. When one thing fails, it creates a chain reaction. I've seen similar patterns in civilian aircraft, just not this complex." They spent the next 2 hours going through every system in the plane. Maria's approach was methodical and intuitive, combining her deep understanding of aircraft mechanics with a natural ability to see connections that others missed. Jackson found himself relying on her insights more and more as they worked. The real breakthrough came when Maria suggested they physically inspect the hydraulic lines near the landing gear. Jackson was reluctant at first. Accessing those components required removing several panels and crawling into tight spaces that were difficult for someone his size to navigate. "I can get in there," Maria offered. "I'm smaller, and I've spent half my life crawling around inside aircraft." Jackson hesitated. This was a $50 million military asset with classified components. Allowing a civilian to work on it violated about a dozen regulations. But they were running out of options, and Maria had already demonstrated knowledge that exceeded most military technicians. "Okay," he said finally, "but I need to supervise everything you do." Maria squeezed into the narrow space near the landing gear assembly, her flashlight illuminating the complex maze of hydraulic lines, electrical connections, and mechanical components. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but she had worked in worse conditions. Her experienced hands moved carefully among the sensitive components, feeling for problems that might not be visible to the eye. "Found it," she called out after 20 minutes of careful inspection. "There's a hairline crack in the main hydraulic line. It's tiny, probably caused by the stress of that hard landing, but it's enough to cause pressure fluctuations." Jackson crawled as far into the space as he could manage, squinting at the area Maria was pointing to. At first he couldn't see anything wrong, but when she showed him the exact spot the crack became visible, a thin line no bigger than a human hair running along the side of the hydraulic fitting. "That's impossible," he breathed. "How did you—" Spot something that small? Practice, Maria replied simply. I've been looking for tiny problems in aircraft systems for 15 years. You learn to see things that don't belong. But finding the problem was only half the battle. The damaged hydraulic line would need to be replaced before the aircraft could safely fly again. Jackson contacted his base using a satellite phone, explaining the situation to his commanding officer. The conversation was tense and filled with technical jargon that Maria couldn't fully follow, but she caught enough to understand the severity of the situation. They're sending a replacement, pardon a technical crew, Jackson explained after ending the call. But it's going to take at least 18 hours, maybe longer, with this weather system still affecting flights in the region. Maria nodded, but something in his expression suggested there was more to the story. There's another problem, Jackson continued reluctantly. The base commander is concerned about security protocols. Having this aircraft sitting unguarded at a civilian airport for an extended period makes everyone nervous. They want it moved as soon as possible. But you said the replacement crew won't arrive until tomorrow. That's the issue. They're asking if there's any way to make temporary repairs that would allow the aircraft to fly back to base today. It's not ideal, but it would solve the security concerns. Maria thought about the damaged hydraulic line. A temporary repair was theoretically possible, but it would be risky and would require precise work under difficult conditions. More importantly, it would require someone with intimate knowledge of both the damage and the aircraft systems to oversee the work. I could do it, she said quietly. Jackson looked at her in surprise. Do what? Make the temporary repair. I've done similar work on civilian aircraft dozens of times. It's not a permanent solution, but it would get you back to base safely. Maria, this isn't a crop duster. One mistake could bring down a $50 million aircraft. I know exactly what it is, Maria replied, her voice steady with confidence. And I know I can fix it. They worked through the afternoon, with Maria carefully crafting a temporary seal for the damaged hydraulic line using materials from Pete's well-stocked workshop. Jackson assisted as much as his injured ankle would allow, but mostly he watched in fascination as Maria worked with the precision of a surgeon and the confidence of someone who had done this kind of repair hundreds of times. The work was delicate and demanding. Maria had to remove multiple components to access the damaged area properly, then reinstall everything with perfect precision. One loose connection or improperly torqued bolt could cause catastrophic failure during flight. As the sun began to set, Maria made the final connections and stepped back to examine her work. The temporary repair looked solid, but the real test would come when they pressurized the system and ran diagnostics. Cross your fingers, she said as Jackson powered up the aircraft systems. The hydraulic system came online smoothly, pressure readings climbing steadily into the normal range. All the error codes that had plagued the aircraft during its emergency landing had disappeared. According to every diagnostic test they could run, the F-22 was ready to fly. But there was one more complication that neither of them had anticipated. Jackson's ankle injury was worse than they had initially thought. After a day of moving around on it, the sprain had become severely swollen and painful. When he tried to climb into the cockpit for a test run, he couldn't operate the rudder pedals properly. I can't fly like this, he admitted reluctantly. The pain is too distracting and I don't have full range of motion in my left foot. They called the base again, and this time the conversation was even more tense. The replacement pilot they had planned to send was now grounded with the flu. Weather conditions were deteriorating again, making it dangerous for another pilot to fly in from a distant base. But leaving the aircraft at the civilian airport overnight was becoming increasingly unacceptable to the military command. As Jackson finished the call, Maria could see the stress written across his face. The situation was becoming impossible to resolve through normal channels. There might be another option, she said carefully. Jackson looked at her, and somehow he already knew what she was going to suggest. You're not serious. I am completely serious. I've studied F-22 systems for the past day. I understand how everything works, and I have more recent flight experience than anyone else who could get here in time. Maria, you were kicked out of pilot training 6 months ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with my flying ability. she replied firmly. "And right now I'm the only option that gets your aircraft back to base safely." Jackson stared at her for a long moment, weighing options that all seemed impossible. Finally, he reached for his satellite phone to make the most difficult call of his military career. The phone call to base command lasted 47 minutes. Maria could hear Jackson's voice rising and falling through the thin walls of Pete's office. Sometimes pleading, sometimes explaining, always urgent. She sat outside on an old folding chair, watching the F-22 gleam in the late afternoon sun, trying not to think about what she was volunteering to do. When Jackson finally emerged, his face was pale and his expression unreadable. "They said yes," he announced quietly. Maria felt her stomach drop. Part of her had been hoping they would refuse, that someone would make the decision for her, and she could go back to her safe, quiet life fixing civilian aircraft. But another part of her, the part that had been dying slowly for 6 months, suddenly flared back to life. "There are conditions," Jackson continued. "Lots of them. I have to stay in radio contact throughout the entire flight. You follow my instructions exactly, no improvisation. And if anything goes wrong, anything at all, you eject immediately. They'd rather lose the aircraft than have a civilian casualty." Maria nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "And Maria," Jackson added, his tone becoming more serious. "What we're about to do is completely unprecedented. No civilian has ever flown an F-22. If word of this gets out, it could end careers, including mine. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" She looked at the aircraft, its angular surfaces reflecting the sky like a mirror. For 6 months she had tried to convince herself that she didn't need flying, that fixing planes was enough. But standing here with the opportunity to pilot the most advanced fighter jet in the world, she realized she had been lying to herself. "I'm sure," she said. The pre-flight preparations took over an hour. Jackson walked her through every system, every emergency procedure, every possible scenario they could think of. Maria's mind absorbed the information like a sponge, connecting new knowledge to principles she already understood. The F-22's controls were more sophisticated than anything she had trained on, but the basic concepts of flight remained the same. "The most important thing to remember," Jackson explained as they did final checks, "is that this aircraft wants to fly. It's designed to be stable and forgiving. Trust the systems, trust your training, and don't overthink it." As Maria climbed into the cockpit, she felt the weight of the moment settling around her. The seat was designed for someone taller, and she had to adjust everything to fit her smaller frame. Jackson helped her with the harness, the helmet, and the complex array of connections that linked her to the aircraft systems. "Radio check." Jackson's voice crackled through her headset. "I hear you clearly," Maria replied, her voice sounding strange to her own ears inside the helmet. "Thunderbird Base, this is Lieutenant Commander Jackson with Emergency Flight Sierra 7 Alpha, requesting departure clearance." The radio response came immediately, professional but tense. "Sierra 7 Alpha, you are cleared for immediate departure. Weather conditions are marginal but acceptable. Report your position every 10 minutes. Maria's hands moved through the startup sequence, muscle memory from her training camp experience combining with the new knowledge Jackson had provided. The twin engines spooled up with a deep rumble that she felt in her bones. Every gauge and display showed green, all systems functioning normally. "Tower Sierra 7 Alpha ready for takeoff," she announced, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "Sierra 7 Alpha, cleared for takeoff. Winds are 270 at 15, gusts to 25. Maria pushed the throttles forward and the F-22 began to roll down the small runway. The acceleration was unlike anything she had ever experienced, smooth but incredibly powerful. Within seconds, she was moving faster than she had ever gone on the ground. At rotation speed, she pulled back gently on the stick, and the aircraft lifted off as gracefully as a bird. The sensation of flying the F-22 was intoxicating. It responded to her thoughts almost before she finished thinking them, climbing rapidly into the clear evening sky. "How does it feel?" Jackson asked through the radio. "Like coming home," Maria replied, and meant it. The flight to Thunderbird Base would take 35 minutes at cruising speed. As Maria settled into the rhythm of flying, she allowed herself to truly appreciate what was happening. 6 months ago, she had been escorted off this very base in disgrace. Now she was returning as the pilot of their most prized aircraft. 20 minutes into the flight, Jackson's voice came through with an edge of excitement. "Maria, I just got word from the tower. Colonel Peterson wants to personally oversee your landing." Maria's heart skipped a beat. Colonel Peterson, the man who had terminated her from the program, would be watching as she brought down an F-22. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. "Copy that," she managed to say. As the base came into view, Maria could see activity on the ground that was unusual for this time of day. Vehicles were positioned around the runway and people were gathered near the tower. Word had clearly spread that something extraordinary was happening. "Sierra 7 Alpha, Thunderbird Tower, you are cleared for approach runway 27. Winds are 280 at 12, visibility unlimited." Maria began her descent, configuring the aircraft for landing according to the procedures Jackson had drilled into her. The F-22 handled like a dream, responding precisely to every input. As she lined up with the runway, she could see the crowd of people watching from the ground. "Looking good, Maria," Jackson encouraged through the radio. "Just like we practiced. Trust the aircraft." The landing was textbook perfect. Maria touched down smoothly at the exact spot she had been aiming for, the aircraft settling onto the runway with barely a bump. She applied the brakes gradually, bringing the powerful fighter to a controlled stop well before the end of the runway. "Sierra 7 Alpha, welcome to Thunderbird Base," the tower controller said, and Maria could hear the amazement in his voice. As she taxied toward the parking area, Maria could see the crowd of people waiting for her. Instructors, students, ground crew and officers had all gathered to witness this unprecedented arrival. At the front of the group stood Colonel Peterson, his expression unreadable from this distance. Maria shut down the engines and began the post-flight checklist, her hands steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Everything had gone perfectly. She had just successfully flown and landed one of the most advanced aircraft in the world, proving to herself and everyone watching that she belonged in the sky. The canopy opened with a soft hiss, and Maria began the process of disconnecting from the aircraft's systems. As she climbed out of the cockpit, the crowd approached, their faces showing a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and respect. Colonel Peterson was the first to reach her. For a moment, they stood facing each other in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Then, slowly, the colonel extended his hand. "Outstanding flying," he said simply. "That was one of the smoothest F-22 landings I've ever witnessed." Maria shook his hand, feeling 6 months of anger and disappointment beginning to dissolve. "Thank you, sir." "I owe you an apology," Colonel Peterson continued, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "And I owe you an explanation. The decision to dismiss you from our program was based on factors that had nothing to do with your flying ability or your potential as a pilot." He paused, looking around at the crowd of instructors and students who were listening intently. "Sometimes we make mistakes in judgment. Sometimes we let institutional thinking cloud our vision of what's possible. What you've accomplished today proves that talent and determination are more important than background or conventional expectations." From his jacket pocket, Colonel Peterson pulled out an official-looking envelope. "This is a formal invitation to return to our program, along with a recommendation for advanced placement based on the skills you've demonstrated. The choice is yours, but I hope you'll consider giving us another chance to do right by you." Maria took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. 6 months ago, she had walked away from this base with her dreams shattered. Now she was standing here as the pilot who had just delivered their most valuable aircraft safely home. "I'll consider it," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "But things will need to be different this time." Colonel Peterson nodded. "They will be. You have my word on that." As the crowd began to disperse, Jackson approached on his crutches, grinning widely. "So, how does it feel to be the first civilian to land an F-22? Maria looked back at the aircraft, then up at the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. "It feels like the beginning of something new." The small-town mechanic who had been rejected and dismissed had proven that dreams don't die easily. Sometimes they just wait for the right moment to soar again, higher than anyone ever imagined possible.